You wake up this morning, and before your feet even hit the floor, it's there. That familiar knot in your stomach about the presentation at work, the conversation you've been avoiding, or the dream you keep pushing to next year. Roosevelt knew this feeling intimately, though he'd never admit it publicly. When he spoke those famous words on March 4th, 1933, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," he wasn't just addressing a nation in economic freefall. He was speaking directly to you, across nearly a century, about the invisible enemy that lives in your chest. Picture Roosevelt that morning, preparing for his first inaugural address. Outside the Capitol, 13 million Americans were unemployed, 1 in 4 workers. Banks had collapsed like dominoes, wiping out life savings overnight. Families were selling their furniture to buy bread. The country wasn't just broke, it was broken, paralyzed by a terror so complete that people had stopped trying. They'd given up before they'd even begun to fight back. But here's what Roosevelt understood that most people miss. The real catastrophe wasn't the stock market crash or the bank failures. The real catastrophe was happening inside people's minds. Fear had become a virus, spreading faster than any economic contagion, convincing millions of Americans that tomorrow would inevitably be worse than today. They'd stopped spending, stopped investing, stopped believing, not because the situation was hopeless, but because fear had convinced them it was hopeless. You do this too, don't you? You felt that paralyzing certainty that things will go wrong before you've even tried. Maybe it's asking for that promotion, starting that business, or having that difficult conversation with someone you love. The situation itself might be manageable, but fear whispers its predictions. You'll embarrass yourself. They'll say no, you're not qualified, you're not ready. And suddenly you're not fighting the actual challenge. You're fighting the phantom version that fear has conjured in your imagination. Roosevelt had every reason to be terrified himself. He was inheriting a presidency during the worst economic crisis in American history, leading a country that had lost faith in its own government. Politicians before him had tried speeches, policies, and promises. Nothing had worked. The weight of expectation was crushing, and the margin for error was non-existent. One wrong move could push the nation from depression into complete collapse. Yet something remarkable happened when Roosevelt stepped up to that microphone. Instead of pretending the danger wasn't real, instead of minimizing the crisis or offering false optimism, he did something revolutionary. He named fear as the enemy. Not unemployment, not bank failures, not economic policy, fear itself. He understood that you can't solve problems when you're paralyzed by the anticipation of failure. This wasn't just political rhetoric, it was psychological warfare. Roosevelt was declaring war on the thing that had already defeated his constituents before they'd even started fighting. He was telling you, telling them, telling everyone who would listen, the monster you're really battling isn't out there in the world. It's in here between your ears, and it's been lying to you about what's possible. Think about your own life right now. How many opportunities have you talked yourself out of before you even explored them? How many times have you chosen the safe path not because it was better, but because fear made the alternative seem impossible? Roosevelt's insight cuts through all of that noise with surgical precision. Most of what you're afraid of exists only in the future you're imagining, not in the present moment where you actually have power to act. You need to understand what was happening inside Roosevelt's body when he made that declaration, because the same thing happens inside yours every single day. His legs were paralyzed. Polio had stolen his ability to walk when he was 39 years old. Every public appearance was an elaborate performance to hide his disability, requiring leg braces, assistance, and careful choreography just to create the illusion of strength. The man telling America not to fear was living with a secret terror that if people discovered his physical vulnerability, they'd lose faith in his ability to lead. Your brain doesn't know the difference between a real tiger and an imaginary one. When fear strikes your amygdala, that ancient alarm system tucked deep in your limbic brain, floods your system with stress hormones, as if your life depends on immediate action. Your heart rate spikes, your breathing becomes shallow, your muscles tense for fight or flight. This response kept your ancestors alive when they faced actual predators, but now it triggers just as intensely when you think about public speaking, job interviews, or sending that text message you've been drafting for 3 days. Roosevelt experienced this same physiological chaos, but he learned something crucial. The feeling of fear and the reality of danger are two completely different things. When he wheeled himself to the podium that March day, his body was screaming warnings about exposure, humiliation, political suicide. Yet the actual threat wasn't his physical condition or even the economic crisis. It was allowing that terror to make his decisions for him. You've been there. That moment when fear convinces you that everyone will notice your mistakes, that you're not qualified, that you'll be found out as a fraud. Your nervous system can't tell the difference between facing a charging bear and facing a challenging conversation with your boss. The chemical cocktail is identical. Adrenaline, cortisol, norepinephrine. Your body preparing for a life or death battle against a threat that exists primarily in your imagination. Here's where Roosevelt's genius becomes clear. He didn't try to eliminate fear. That's impossible and probably dangerous. Fear serves important functions when it's responding to actual threats. Instead, he learned to question fear's credibility as a decision maker. He developed what psychologists now call cognitive diffusion, the ability to observe your fearful thoughts without automatically believing them or acting on them. Think about the last time you were genuinely afraid versus the last time you were anxious about something that might happen. The fear you felt waiting for medical test results was proportional to a real uncertainty, but the anxiety you felt imagining worst-case scenarios about that upcoming presentation, that was fear practicing creative writing, composing elaborate fiction about futures that probably won't happen. Roosevelt understood that fear is a terrible predictor. It's evolutionarily designed to assume the worst because in prehistoric times, paranoia kept you alive. Better to run from a stick you thought was a snake than ignore a snake you thought was a stick. But in modern life, this same system makes you avoid risks that could transform your circumstances, relationships, and opportunities. You can see this playing out in Roosevelt's own correspondence from that period. In private letters, he confessed moments of doubt, uncertainty about whether his policies would work, anxiety about the political gambling he was undertaking. But he'd learned to treat these feelings as information rather than instructions. Fear could tell him what stakes were involved, but it couldn't tell him what choice to make. The neurological reality is that your brain will always generate fearful thoughts. That's its job. But you have the power to choose which thoughts deserve your attention and which ones deserve to be acknowledged and then dismissed. Roosevelt didn't become fearless. He became fear-independent. He could feel afraid and act courageously simultaneously, understanding that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. This is the skill you need to develop, not the elimination of fear, but the ability to act while afraid. Every time you do something important while scared, you're proving to your nervous system that fear's predictions aren't reliable, gradually reducing its authority over your choices. You're sitting in your living room on a Sunday evening in 1933, and President Roosevelt's voice crackles through your radio speaker. It's his first fireside chat, and something unprecedented is happening. A leader is talking to you not as a subject to be managed, but as a partner in solving the crisis. Roosevelt didn't just practice what he preached about fear. He turned his entire communication strategy into a masterclass in transforming collective anxiety into collective action. These radio addresses became psychological laboratories where Roosevelt demonstrated how to metabolize fear into fuel. He spoke directly into microphones, but he was really speaking directly into the part of your brain where terror lives. Instead of avoiding difficult topics, he walked straight toward them. Banking crisis? Let's talk about it. Unemployment? Here's what we're doing. War clouds gathering in Europe, we'll face that too. He understood that secrets and silence are fear's favorite breeding grounds. You've experienced this in your own life. How problems seem impossibly large when you're wrestling with them alone in your head at 3 in the morning, but become manageable when you finally voice them to someone you trust. Roosevelt was doing this on a national scale, taking the monsters out of the shadows and examining them in broad daylight. The problems were still real, but they were no longer mysterious or insurmountable. His genius wasn't in promising easy solutions. It was in reframing the relationship between Americans and their challenges. Instead of saying, "Don't worry," he said, "Here's how we worry productively." Instead of minimizing the dangers, he transformed fear from a paralyzing force into organizing energy. You can do this too. That anxiety about your career transition isn't your enemy. It's information about how much your growth matters to you. That nervousness before important conversations isn't weakness. It's evidence that the relationship is significant enough to warrant careful attention. Roosevelt's approach reveals something profound about human psychology. People can handle almost any external challenge if they believe they have agency in addressing it. What destroys us isn't difficulty, it's helplessness. When you feel trapped by circumstances, fear metastasizes into despair. But when you have a role to play, even in uncertain outcomes, fear transforms into focused attention and strategic energy. Watch how this works in your daily life. You're less afraid of challenges when you have a plan, even if the plan is imperfect. You're less anxious about conversations when you've thought through your key points, even if you can't control the other person's response. Roosevelt was giving an entire nation the psychological equivalent of a plan, helping people move from "what's going to happen to us" to "what are we going to do next?" The fireside chats worked because Roosevelt had learned to treat fear as a consultant rather than a commander. Fear could provide valuable information about potential risks and necessary preparations, but it couldn't make the decision about whether to move forward. This distinction is crucial for you to master. Your anxiety about starting that creative project contains useful data about what matters to you and what skills you might need to develop. But that same anxiety has no business deciding whether you should begin. Every person who has accomplished something meaningful has learned this secret. Fear is not a stop sign, it's a yield sign. It's asking you to look both ways, check your preparation, and proceed with awareness rather than recklessness. Roosevelt didn't lead America out of the Depression by eliminating fear. He did it by teaching people to act courageously while afraid. Think about the biggest regrets in your life. Most of them probably aren't about times when you tried something and it didn't work out perfectly. They're about times when fear convinced you not to try at all. Roosevelt understood that the greatest risk isn't failure, it's the slow death of never discovering what you're capable of when you refuse to let fear make your decisions. As the years pass and you look back on this moment in your life, you'll realize that Roosevelt's words weren't just about economic recovery or wartime leadership. They were about the fundamental choice every human faces. Will you let your fears write the story of your life, or will you pick up the pen yourself? The only thing you truly have to fear is allowing fear to become your biographer, editing out all the chapters where you might have surprised yourself with your own courage, strength, and capability. Your greatest adventures, deepest relationships, and most meaningful contributions are waiting on the other side of the fears you've been carrying. Roosevelt knew this truth, lived this truth, and proved it possible for an entire generation. Now it's your turn to prove it possible for yourself, one brave choice at a time.